Hello, and welcome to the Agroforestry in Action webinar series. Today's presentation, Silvopasture Research in the Eastern Coastal Plain of North Carolina, with Alan Franzluebbers, will begin in just a few moments. The Agroforestry in Action webinar series is a production of the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri. I'm your host, Gregory Ormsby-Maury, Education and Outreach Coordinator for the Center. Agroforestry in Action webinars in the series they're held about approximately every month or so. And for more information on upcoming webinars and recordings of all past webinars, you can find that on our website. That's centerforagroforestry.org. That's the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri's website. Today's presentation will run about 40 or 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for some question and answer, some discussion after that. So let me take a moment to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Alan Franzluebbers is a research ecologist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service, the USDA ARS, and he's located on the campus of North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. He has more than 30 years of experience, starting with a master's program in Nebraska, a PhD in Texas, and postdoctoral position in Alberta, Canada, and then as a full-time soil scientist in Georgia before his current position with the USDA ARS in North Carolina. His research interests include soil ecology and management for development of more sustainable agricultural systems. Soil health methodologies and soil organic carbon sequestration are tools that he works with, and often used to interpret the effects of management on soil resources. Other recent areas of research are in multi-species cover cropping, agroforestry, integrated crop livestock systems, nitrogen management, and conservation tillage cropping. Alan is the ARS lead of the USDA Southeast Region Climate Hub, and he currently serves on the board of directors for the Soil Science Society of America and the American Forage and Grassland Council. So please let us welcome our today's speaker, Dr. Alan Franzluebbers. Alan?
Thank you, Gregory, and welcome to all the participants. Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to speak with you today on agroforestry. It's something that I've had a passion for a number of years, but once I moved to North Carolina, I was able to fully engage in that. And that was mainly because of Dr. Paul Mueller, who has since retired from the crops science department here at NC State. But he was one of the instrumental people in forming the Center for Environmental Farming Systems in Goldsboro, North Carolina, on the coastal plain. And in this picture here, you see him planting the young pine saplings into an agricultural field. And these are in rows, and so this was an agricultural field. There's corn residue there that shows that it was being cropped previously. The site that we are having our research investigation on is approximately 17 acres in the original agroforestry design. It was started in 2007 by Dr. Mueller and Fred Cubbage. And I must say that our leadership team includes myself as well as Miguel Castillo on forage agronomy and Matt Poor with animal science. And then, of course, we have Fred Cubbage in the forestry department as well. This is a site that is very close to the Neuse River. It's a floodplain region. In fact, in the last 3 years, it has flooded. On this experiment, water up to a foot and sometimes 2 foot above the soil line there. We have basically an alley cropping system, 3 row sets of 6 foot by 6 foot diamond spacing, and it was cropped to corn and soybeans during the first 6 years. The tree species that we have are longleaf pine, loblolly pine, and cherry bark oak. It's on a coastal plain site near Goldsboro, and it is located on the Center for Environmental Farming Systems, which was started back in 1997. The original objectives were to really create a demonstration farm for landowners, farmers, and professionals in North Carolina, and as well as to conduct research on alley cropping, and the vision was to transition to silvopasture. Of course, we wanted to, the original objectives were to look at production, the trade-offs between the trees, crops, and the pasture, because certainly the competition does create some trade-offs that one has to be aware of. And it's an excellent site for training graduate students, so the educational component is important, as well as the extension component too, for us to showcase agroforestry and silvopasture to our stakeholders in the region. During the first 7 years, we basically had concluded that there was successful tree establishment. Certainly the trees performed well, even the oaks and the longleaf pine, under what was considered frequent drought and flood, both extremes, because in the first 7 years we had 4 of those events that led to some change in why we actually wanted to move faster to the transition to silvopasture. The crops did not perform so well, especially in that region of the experiment where we had dry, sandy soil. And we had better crops in the wet clay areas, and that would be closer to the Neuse River in one of our blocks. But that is an area that frequently floods when water is available. These data are some of the tree survival data that we have. We have 5 blocks of 5 replications of these 3 tree species, and these data show that actually survival was quite good back in 2015 after 8 years. And we had anywhere from 86 to 95% survival. The low values were in some of the blocks that were farthest from the river, and certainly there were some issues with the longleaf pines in soils that tended to be saturated, and that most of the loblolly pine survived well in any position in the landscape. These are data of tree height in August 2015, again after 8 years of growth. And we do see that there's a pretty good growth of the loblolly pine. It was the most prolific species. The photo on the top does show the loblolly pine in the middle, and then the cherry bark oak, considerably smaller in height. But we expected that based on the initial establishment period, and we expect much greater growth in the future. And the longleaf pine was somewhat intermediate. All of the growth is of the trees, of the forage, of any cropping that we make, are always better in block number 5. This is the block that is closest to the river, and so it has a little bit different soil. It stays wetter, and it allows all of our plant species to perform a little bit better. The diameter at breast height was also different among the tree species. So certainly the loblolly pine it's a preferred commercial species. All 3 species are native to the region, but the loblolly pine is commercial. It's the most widely grown timber species in North Carolina. And but we do have a place for the longleaf pine, and its growth is certainly adequate. And the bottomland hardwood oak is certainly valuable for a hardwood timber, for furniture, and we expect that we will have good growth as years come to pass. So back in 2013, when we were about to plant soybean for the 3rd time, we actually found that it was difficult to get the soybean planted because we had very excess precipitation and we had flooding across the site. And so that made us realize that we should make this transition to the pasture, because we had no fences up. We had time that we needed to spend getting the site prepared for a silvopasture. We went ahead and planted ryegrass on the first part of the experiment. So we planted ryegrass in fall of 2013, harvested it for baleage in 2014, and then transitioned into a native warm season grass. This image shows the experiment as it was on the top half, as originally designed with the alleys and the trees in rows. And the bottom half was an addition to the experiment in that we wanted to compare a grazed open pasture with those silvopasture paddocks in the upper portion. We also wanted to make this a real dynamic research experiment, and so we have a central area that is grazed by cattle. We also have an area where we cut it for biomass, for hay, and then we have grass that's cut for either cut for biofuel harvest or left for conservation reserve. And so we wanted to make that comparison to know the impact of our management on soil properties. We also left a strip that was tilled cropland because this was cropland, and we wanted to have that as a reference point. So in June 2014, we made our first establishment of the native warm season grasses, and we had a mixture of switchgrass, of big blue stem, of Indian grass, and of eastern gamma grass. It was a mixture amongst all of the area there. We planted under both conventional tillage seedbed and no tillage seedbed because we were not sure the appropriate method, and so we wanted to test this out since we had a reasonable area to make this test. And so on the left is the conventional tilled seedbed, and you see the seedlings. And you also see a lot of green, which during the first year we thought we might have had a failure of our native warm season grass because the weeds were very abundant, and we thought maybe we had missed out on the opportunity to really get establishment. But come the next spring, we did see the rows of the native warm season grasses. I should mention that we did clip the weeds, the grasses that came up frequently. We clipped at about a 10 to 12 inch height, or 20 to 30 centimeters height, and tried to just make sure that there was always sunlight penetrating. And certainly the next spring we did see these rows of grasses coming up. And as the summer progressed, we had a reasonable stand that we could consider successful. And by the end of the first growing season, we had even inflorescences showing up, and we had essentially a successful grass establishment. Now, in the open pasture, we started that planting in 2015, and so it was 1 year delayed. And this is an image of that open pasture there. So we had the conventional tillage on the left and the no tillage establishment on the right. But as of today, we see no difference in any establishment that was there. We did make some measurements, and the measurements were that we had actually more plants under the no tillage than under the clean tillage. But essentially there's no difference as the tillers have expanded. So I wanted to share some actual results of what we've been making measurements on to give you a sense of what our perspective has been in the eastern coastal plain of North Carolina. We've taken some measurements on greenhouse gas emissions. The U.S. Forest Service was generous with some financial support for us, and they were interested in knowing a little bit more about CO2 and nitrous oxide emission from the soil. So we placed these static chambers under the trees, as well as in areas that were away from the trees. So in this diagram here, we have chambers under the trees. We have a chamber that is in the margin between the trees and the alley, and then we have one chamber that is out in the open in the middle of the alley. This is an overview of the site where we made the greenhouse gas emission evaluations. We had 42 daily events from October 2013 to September 2014. We had a total of 45 chambers that were placed out there. Those chambers, again, were placed under the trees, at the margin of the trees in the alley, and then in the open. And this happened to be during a period where we were transitioning from the cropping to the pasture. So we had annual ryegrass, and then towards the end of the period, we would have had some of the perennial warm season grasses, native warm season grasses there. We had established this greenhouse gas emission research in blocks 3, 4, and 5, and you can see that it's labeled with 9% clay in block 3. We have 16% clay in block 4 and 32% clay in block 5. Again, this block 5 is closest to the river. It is also the highest clay concentration, and so we expected to have some unique characteristics in greenhouse gas emissions based on the soil properties. So these 45 chambers were replicated 3 times within. They were replicated 3 times within the trees here, and then we had 3 replications within a block here. So we were able to use the textural difference, the gradient, as an indicator for us. So Janet Chappell was the graduate student that made these measurements. She was a real trooper to actually get out there those 42 times, roughly every 10 days to 2 weeks that she was out there, and she certainly found insects, spiders, and snakes along with her out there. These are some of the actual measurements or the results that we had. This is the mean of 42 observations over those 3 spatial replications. The graph is full, but this is the nitrous oxide emission that occurs under the cropped alley, in the margin, and then under each of the 3 tree species. The main point first is that the emissions under the crop system were much higher than under the trees, and then the margin area was intermediate between the cropped and under the trees. The second point is that actually the block made a big difference, in that we had under block 3, 4, and 5, this gradient of texture was really important for us to understand that in the literature, we do see this as well, is that the higher the clay concentration, the greater the nitrous oxide emission. And this occurred under the crop system, as well as in the margin, but it did not occur under the trees. And you'll notice also that the emissions under the trees were always very low. Now the cropped area was fertilized with nitrogen for the ryegrass, but not for the native warm season grass, but it was fertilized, so at a relatively low rate, not an excessive rate at all. And so it just shows that there is greater emission in the cropped areas than under the trees. And so an agroforestry system could potentially take up nitrogen and release, sequester that away from the emission process. These are the data for carbon dioxide emission, expressed in kilograms of carbon per hectare per day. And the somewhat similar results occurred, although a little bit different, in that we had higher emissions from the cropped, intermediate in the margin, and then lower emissions under the trees. Now under the trees, of course, we are measuring both soil respiration, heterotrophic respiration, as well as autotrophic respiration from the tree roots themselves. And in the cropped alley, of course, it's from the forage species that are out there. But we did not see this large gradient effect of the soil texture on CO2 emissions. So it was not real obvious in that case. But we did see this larger CO2 emission because this cropped area had previously been tilled, but now was being managed under no tillage. And that there's more of that carbon that was being oxidized compared to that under the trees. One explanation could be that the soil moisture was different. And we did measure soil moisture differences, and we did find that on occasion, of course, on 42 observations, we didn't always find the same consistency, but we did see that the trees took up a lot of water at certain times of the year, and that led to a difference in the emissions. So we also measured soil organic carbon stock early in the study, and this was after 7 years. And I just wanted to share a little bit about that because we had an impression that actually soil would change. So we collected soil at 0 to 5 centimeters and 5 to 20 centimeters, and this photo on the right shows that separation into the 0 to 5 and the 5 to 20 centimeter depth. We measured for organic carbon and nitrogen fractions. We had measured that with bulk density and the soil texture to verify that. So again, we measured this in the same positions where the greenhouse gas chambers were, and these are the results of the soil measurements at the end of 7 years. The first thing to notice is that we have a declining soil organic carbon with depth, and this is nothing new. This is often observed in many of our southeastern U.S. soils, is that we have high carbon concentration at the surface, and it declines dramatically with depth. The next observation is that essentially there was no difference between the middle of the cropped alley and under the trees, which was a little bit surprising. It went against my hypothesis. But the other effect was that we actually had a lower level of carbon in the margin area. And this margin area tends to be trafficked a little bit more because this is where the agricultural operations in the field are at the margin. So there's always some traffic here, but also the plant growth is much reduced in this area, not only from the trees, but also from the forages. And so there's very little autotrophic production of the plant production here. And so this may lead to lower carbon inputs. And essentially at 5 to 20 centimeter depth, there were no changes that occurred. For soil bulk density, there was essentially no real major difference other than that the lower carbon at the surface led to higher bulk density in the margin area. And this is often observed that there's an inverse relationship between soil organic carbon and soil bulk density. So the reason to have greater carbon sequestration is actually to improve fertility, because the physical stability of the soil is important, and this porosity is important to be developed with lower bulk density. I'd like to move now to a study where we actually looked at geospatial distribution of the soil properties prior to establishing the native warm season grasses. And this diagram shows where we actually had our sampling points. We had 9 sampling points in each of the alleys in each of the blocks, and we had 5 alleys in a block, and we had 5 blocks. So we had over 200 sampling points. We measured at 0 to 5, 5 to 15, and 15 to 30 centimeter depths. And this is a spatially distributed map then of clay concentration. We see that we have a zone of relatively low clay concentration here in the middle. This is where in the past we had very poor crop production in blocks 2 and 3. This was often observed in the early parts of the study. And then we had this higher clay concentration near the river, where the deposition of clay was occurring at a greater rate. But we also had plenty of variation within the block. So we had areas of less than 10% clay, and then we had areas of greater than 20% clay, even in the same block. In block number 1, we often get poorer production of forage and of our tree survival because we have wet areas that are also occurring there, partly because of the higher clay concentration. So with that, we also looked at the soil organic carbon, and the soil organic carbon was generally related to the clay concentration. We had highest carbon concentration near the river in block number 5, but we also had these areas where there was a level of higher carbon accumulation also tended to be associated with clay concentration. And this is somewhat integrated together, where we have total organic carbon on the y-axis as related to clay concentration on the x-axis. So with low clay concentration, we had low carbon stock, and with higher clay concentration, we increased carbon stock considerably. But then there was this plateau that occurred, and this plateau was mainly due to block number 5. Now we had a range of clay concentration in block number 5, but there was basically a stable relationship there that occurred. And subsequently to this research that my colleague Leonardo Dace led, was that we actually think that there are maybe some differences in clay mineralogy between blocks number 1 and block number 5. So block number 1 also had some higher clay concentration here. You see some values that would be all mixed in here. But the block number 5 seemed to behave differently. And so this gives us an opportunity to look at that a little more in depth. And speaking of depth, we had similar relationships with depth, although it changed. The lower down in the profile we got, we didn't see as clear of a plateau effect that occurred. And in fact, this is maybe what we would have expected, is that there was a linear relationship between total organic carbon and clay concentration. So we've subsequently made some measurements, and this was a study that we did after 9 years of establishment. And we looked at getting an idea of a transect across the alleys to know what is the influence of the trees on soil organic carbon and other soil properties. So we marked every 1.3 meters. We marked areas where we would actually sample across the transect. We would have these areas across the alleys and look at the carbon and soil properties, the bulk density, the residue accumulation. And this was a project of Chris Smith that is finishing up on this project. So this is just a view across the alley that where we made transects. We made transects for each of the tree species in all 5 blocks, so we had 15 transects across the study. And the generalization here, or the summary, would be that soil organic carbon and concentration as a function of distance from the center. These green areas are the tree canopy areas. And so we sampled 2 areas under the tree canopy, and then we had 8 areas in between in the alley. And so this was from the south tree line, and this is from the north tree line, and we figured there might have been some differences for that. But we do see that the elevated organic carbon concentration that we expected early in the study was occurring after 9 years, and that we had this at the 0 to 5 centimeter depth. Well, at 5 to 15 centimeter depth, we essentially did not see that. We saw a reversal effect, and we see that the organic carbon is declining with depth, as we expect, but there was no elevation under the trees. And so the tree impact is mainly due to the residues that are dropped from the trees themselves. And then at 15 to 30 centimeter depth, there essentially is no relationship at all. And so that we have this opportunity with time to see how these things change. And we'll repeat these transect measurements over time, because that's what's really needed, because the forestry component is a long-term nature. Now that we have a native warm season grass in the mix in the alleys, we expect to see some elevated levels of organic carbon in the alley. But we'd like to know, is that uniform across the alley, or is there a peak in the middle? So another way of looking at carbon is to look at soil test biological activity. This is the actual activity of the carbon from soil microorganisms, the heterotrophic activity in soil. So under loblolly pine, we also saw this elevated soil biological activity under the trees compared to in the alleys. And it was dramatic enough. In this case, these are data from these 0 to 5 centimeters. Under the longleaf pine, a similar result occurred. Now there were some general differences in the levels in the alleys, but essentially there was a difference between the trees and in the alley, in the forage alleys. But when we added the cherry bark oak, we saw a completely different relationship, and there was no elevation of organic carbon under the trees. And so this gives us an idea that perhaps, well, it's not perhaps, it is the litter quality of the trees that's influencing the biological activity. And so we are having, of course, the trees under the cherry bark oak are smaller than under the longleaf, the loblolly pine and the longleaf. And that may have an influence on the amount of residue that's being deposited at the surface, but it's likely also the quality of the residue that's leading to this change. And we, again, expect that if we measure this every 4 to 5 or 6 years, that we will see some differences that occur over time. I'd like to move to forage production characteristics in the study. We've made some measurements because we do have cattle on the study now. We started grazing in 2015. Just at the end of the season, our first real season was in 2016. So we have hay production in a 1-cut versus a 2-cut system. We measured that under each of the 3 tree species. Essentially, we saw no difference in the forage production, although we see this slight indication of a trend, and that all of the data subsequently indicate this, that perhaps under the longleaf pine, because of the larger growth of the tree, perhaps more of the alley is being shaded and reducing forage production. This is just only an indication. It is not statistically significant, but it shows up in the June cut as well as in the September cut. And that is from the 2-cut system, so if we add that together, there's this potential indication that perhaps the loblolly pine may reduce some of the forage production. In the 1-cut system, the similar kind of thing occurred as well, and these happen to be from obviously different plots. But the big thing was that for us in agricultural production, the 2-cut system was produced more forage biomass, so the native warm season grasses responded to the cut by increasing their biomass production immediately after the cut. And so I think this is something that producers have to be aware of, that managing the native warm season grasses in a silvopasture is really, really important. In 2018, we have a June cut that I can share the results for with you. It was lower because of the environmental conditions. We did tend to get out there a little bit earlier as well. We're making our way through the system, learning more about the timing, and just because it's a big experiment, getting the farm crew to do that. Now this week we're just making the September cut because we had a flood from Hurricane Florence, and so that delayed everything, and so we're actually just making the cut, the bales this week. The nutritive value for the stocking of cattle on the silvopasture, we assessed that in the hay versus the grade situation, and we looked at crude protein percent. Crude protein is relatively low in these native warm season grasses. The values are around 4% in the June cut. Certainly not much to lead to excellent cattle gains. It is a limitation. In the September cut, we had some indication that perhaps because of our fertilization in midsummer, that maybe it was elevated a little bit, but also the environmental conditions changed. We had more precipitation later in the year than earlier in the year. And in the one-cut system, it was also, again, very low. Of course, when you have mature forage from these native warm season grasses, the quality is relatively low. In the gray situation, because the animals are keeping the forage mass lower, the grasses are able to regrow, and so they are having higher quality because of that. So we do have a rotational system. We keep the animals only for a half a week on any one particular plot of the experiment. And in the open pasture, the crude protein was 6.5%. So very similar to that under the grazed in the trees. Seasonally, we had forage nutritive value that was certainly, again, nothing very exciting, in that we would like to see values around 10% or higher, but almost all of the values were lower than that situation. Again, these might have been because of the poultry litter that we applied at the end of June, beginning of July. To tell you the truth, I forget the date that we had it, but it was in midsummer that we applied that. And that may have caused that, but there was a sharp decline as well, and so the grasses just don't have as high a forage quality as some of our other introduced species. Now, if we overlay the open pasture in the squares onto that, we see that the values of the crude protein are essentially no different. There was no real seasonal changes that were occurring across both systems. There's essentially 6 to 8% crude protein that is out there. And so it does provide a forage that can maintain stock, but it's not something that is going to be of the highest quality. We have groups that often come to visit the site. We have several times a year. We have groups come out to look at it because there is interest in our area of transitioning some of our non-productive agricultural land into silvopasture. And this is Dr. Miguel Castillo explaining a little bit about the forage establishment. We continue to trim the trees for timber production. We're about to thin the trees in some cases to know what is the impact of tree density in this silvopasture system. But we're having excellent growth of the loblolly pine as well as the longleaf pine, and certainly many of our cherry bark oak species in the bottomland area are doing really, really well. I give thanks to all of our farm crew for their excellent effort in maintaining this site. It's a relatively big site so for us to maintain, and it takes a great deal of effort. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them, and you can email me at either now or after this webinar. This is my email address. This is a collaboration of the Center for Environmental Farming System and several USDA agencies who have taken part in the effort, and so we enjoy that. You can find more information at our website at the Center for Environmental Farming System, in that we post information from time to time, and we'll provide some updates from time to time, and you can find out more about that. And we're certainly open to input and opportunities for any sort of collaboration across scales. So thanks very much.
Hello. Thank you, Alan. Thanks for that presentation. Good. We do have some time for questions and discussions. I'm going to open up a dialog box, a Q&A box, so that participants can write in some questions here. There it is there. You should, folks joining us should be able to see this Q&A box, and there should be a dialog box at the bottom to write in any questions. As some of those questions are coming in, maybe, well, one, I have a question, but also I see that Ed Meisner has written in a question here in the chat box, Alan, and I think when you were reviewing some of the data on soil carbon, can you see that comment and able to address that? He was wondering about the significance of soil carbon levels and whether you were looking at change in sea levels over the 7-year period.
It's a good question. Of course, we do not have actual soil values at the beginning, but on the geospatial measurements that we made in the alleys only, and so we're using that as our estimate of the initial condition, and it is the initial condition for the forage species, certainly, and it's reasonable for under the trees as well. So the levels that we saw were, of course, they were elevated under the longleaf pine and the loblolly pine, but not under the cherry bark oak. And so I think it's, even 7 years, even 9 years is a relatively short period of time in the grand scheme of things for an agroforestry system. So we will continue to make those measurements at pre-row.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. So again, folks joining us, there is the dialog box for you to submit any questions for Alan. As some of those come in, maybe Alan, I'd like to go back to just the information on the hay production and see if I understood. Now, granted, there's only data for not even 2 full years yet. Is that correct? So it's be tough to draw.
Yes, 2 years only. Yep.
Yeah. So, but initial indication was that the hay production. Now, this is across several plots. So, the hay production with the loblolly was noticeably less across. But again, it's not yet able to make a statistically significant or valid conclusion on that. But I'm wondering if that continues to be observed, whether that has implications for species choice in a silvopasture, if we're seeing a species that is continues to be correlated with lower hay production. But I guess it's too early for that kind of suggestion or inference.
Well, I think it is a little bit early just based on the amount of data that we have, but we do have 5 replications of this effect. So statistically, we can make that inference, but it is not statistically significant at this point. It may change in subsequent periods. That was my only point.
Yeah, but I guess I'd be interested to go through other literature and see if that's been observed elsewhere, because it would certainly be used. Go ahead. Yes,
if I may, Dr. Castillo is making measurements of the light penetration through the canopy of the trees and in the open areas. And certainly these native warm season grasses, because they're C4 grasses, they need plenty of light. And if they don't get the light, they will be reduced in biomass considerably.
This is a sampling below across in the alleyways across a spectrum, both in the transition and in the alleyways. So, correct.
It is, but again, we're making these measurements on hay production. In the alleys, we have actually 2 different widths. We have a 12-meter width and we have a 24-meter width. We're making these hay measurements in the 24-meter width. So just based on mathematics, we wouldn't really expect a significant difference because there's a good amount of space.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. These alleyways are quite wide enough that you would not expect that reduction. But let's see, are there any other questions that have come in? Yeah, let's take a look here. Mike Goodchild was asking about the cherry bark oak and why it was chosen for the silvopasture system. He's based in North Florida. Any comments about the selection of the cherry bark oak?
Right. To tell you the truth, I don't know the reason because I was not involved in the design of the study.
Right.
I came in at the end of 6 years when the study was implemented, and so all I can do is suppose that there was an interest in having a diversity of trees to understand maybe whether there was an evergreen, where the leaves don't fall all at once, and versus that of a deciduous in how it might impact either crop production or forage production.
Right. This was established, or initially established, was back in 2007. Now, did I understand correctly that even when it was initially established, the idea on the long trajectory was that it would start off with some allied cropping, and then the plan was it was already built into the plan that it would transition to silvopasture after some years.
That is correct. That's my impression, and that's what I was told by Dr. Mueller. Yes, he had envisioned that it would be a silvopasture at some time.
I see.
And certainly the narrow alleys, the 12-meter alleys, are really quite narrow for forage production. Maybe for timber production and for wildlife habitat, it's just fine, but we're getting a considerable amount of shading that is occurring in the narrow alleys.
Yeah, with the C4 grasses, the warm season grasses, you'd see an impact on biomass production with those light levels reduced. There is one more question that's come in, Alan, and again from Ed. He asks about whether you would expect that the alley soil carbon levels in the oak areas, or the oak alleys, would increase. Are you able to read that there?
I am able to read it, yes. So I believe the question is more about the results we had with the soil test biological activity. In the oak system, there was a lower level under the oaks compared to the open alley. Now, I believe that my hypothesis will be that actually the forage, the rooting of these native warm season grasses is very vigorous. And so I expect we're going to have a great accumulation, perhaps a greater accumulation with depth under the forages than under the trees. And so certainly, yes, the more the oaks grow, the more the buildup of that surface residue and leading to carbon accumulation at the surface. That, I believe, will occur as well.
Thank you. There's another question from Nicholas Frillman, who is conducting his graduate research and looking at silvopasture and through a literature review, looking at misconceptions about silvopasture or barriers to adoption and within that, what people's potential adopters' potential misconceptions about silvopasture might be. And he's asking whether you've encountered any such commonly held misconceptions that potential adopters have as an obstacle or a reason why they would not easily adopt silvopasture. Any comments on that, or anything you've encountered in your work?
No, thanks. It's a great question, and it can be an answer that goes on for a long time, because there are many constraints to adoption of silvopasture, certainly, because it doesn't fit the industrial model that we have in agriculture. Now, it fits more from a forestry perspective because it's just basically thinning the forest. And if you have enough light penetration, forages will grow. But the species matters. So native warm season grasses, again, a C4 grass, they need plenty of light. And they thrive more under full sunlight. So anytime we have trees out there, we're going to limit them. But that doesn't mean that it has to be a monocrop forage system. Now, we have 4 different species, but to tell you the truth, we're dominated by switchgrass. The others just haven't proliferated much. But we should also be looking at C3 grasses and C3 forbs in the system, because there's an opportunity where we do have light penetration even under the trees. Maybe we could get some C3 grasses and forbs growing there, and we could actually increase productivity that way. But the barriers to silvopasture adoption are many, because well, if you're not an animal person, a livestock person, then you have to learn that, and it's not an easy task. So that's one thing. Forestry is to make money on that is difficult, even under the best situations, and so it's a challenge. One has to take risks, and of course, providing water, predators. There are many issues that are out there, but there are plenty of lands where silvopasture makes sense. There are two ways to go, right? One can have a forest or a plantation that is being thinned and plant forages. It's a easier step to make, because those open pastures, and if you want to plant, and the other way is the open pastures, planting trees into them, takes a little bit more design and consideration of how that's going to how to protect the trees against the grazing animals.
Great, thank you, Alan. So there's a few other questions that have come in. Now, Donald Dubois, his question is about silvopasture as a viable management alternative in southern New England. Now, that might be a bit out of your regional experience. I don't know if you've had occasion to work or do any research in the southern New England area.
I have not, but I think that because of the somewhat similar condition in that both regions have plenty of moisture, there's plenty of opportunity to make it a viable option in New England as well. Because you have forested lands, and all one really has to do is concentrate on knowing the amount of light that a forage species needs, and it makes for a very good setting for comfort of the animal. But the big issue that we always want to stress in our system also is that we are rotating our livestock through this system. We are not keeping the animals in a continuous stock situation. This is, I think, probably the number one issue, that if you have a continuous stocking system, tree survival is going to be jeopardized.
Right. Yeah, and that's the key. Rotational grazing is essential for successful silvopasture. That's a message we begin with that as a fundamental message in considering silvopasture. Getting back to Donald's question there about southern New England, maybe I just worth mentioning that yes, Donald, there are a number of good examples in southern New England, as well as New York State and northern New York State and Vermont. And there's a core group of folks up there who are doing some great work. Brett Chedzoy with Cornell Cooperative Extension in New York State, Roy Brubaker in Pennsylvania, Joe Orifice, who was with Paul Smiths and Cornell and is now at Yale in Connecticut, has got a great program of research on silvopasture. So I'd refer you to their work. We can follow up by email if you have difficulty finding the links, as well as the Silvopasture Ning website that is a discussion group predominantly in the Northeast, but accommodates folks from other regions as well. So maybe one last question there. I think a follow-up question from Ed about climate and soils of a region, and he writes, rather than building soil carbon, maybe the gain is in reducing wind erosion or collecting more snow for moisture storage as some of the benefits of silvopasture in the alleyways. Any reaction or comments to that question?
Yes, great. Thanks for the comment. Ed, I think it's an important one, because depending on the region, the system will be different. Certainly. I was born in the prairies of the middle part of the country, and I know about the issue of wind erosion, and and it's important, and slowing wind erosion is important. Interestingly, though, the coastal plain of North Carolina experiences wind erosion too, and especially in the springtime when the young seedlings that farmers have planted in April, we get a lot of wind coming off of the ocean, and it can really damage the seedlings. And so actually having some tree lines even here is a great consideration. So it doesn't. The silvopasture system does not have to be so many trees per acre or per hectare. There's no prescription. I think finding the right balance for what you want to achieve, that's the important part. But my view is that trees should be a part of our integrated system on a farm, and making them more valuable rather than just a side part, because many farms have woodlands, but we could do more with them. And in fact, in the eastern United States, we probably have more agroforestry that is not accounted for because we have so many margins of pastures where cattle do spend time because they are seeking the comfort of the shade. And it's an important aspect in our hot, relatively humid climate that we have here.
Well, thank you. Very well said about the value and importance of trees in agricultural systems. So I think that's all the questions, and it's been a good discussion. Thank you so much for your presentation and the follow-up discussion and addressing those questions. And thank you to all our participants who have joined us today. This does bring us to the end of this webinar. So once again, thank you for participating. Do please stay in touch and on the Center for Agroforestry.org website, you click on the webinar series link and you'll find information about upcoming webinars as well as recordings of all past webinars. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing through that link on our website, centerforagroforestry.org. As you can also see, Dr. Franzluebbers has posted a link at the top of this final slide that will take you to a website and find more information about their research at CEFS at NC State and some of the agroforestry and silvopasture work that they're conducting. So once again, thank you, and until next time, the next webinar will be on November 14th with Tracy Coulter of the Pennsylvania Bureau of Forestry, and she'll be giving us an overview of the agroforestry outreach and promotion programs they've had in Pennsylvania, which have been, I think, very pioneering, some of the progress they've made. So please join us on November 14th. And once again, thank you to everyone.
Thank you, Greg.
See you next time. Bye-bye now.